In this demonstration, we're going to take a look at what's enabled by Arches for Science, the GCI implementation of which is called DISCO, and show you a little bit about how it works in terms of both putting data into the system and then using it once it's in. To do that, of course, we'll start with how to get data in. We start on the splash page of the system, which you see here, and we can click this search tab that you see at the top left. It'll take a second for this to load the individual implementation of Arches that we're using. And when it does, you see that we land on a page that shows us the ability to search, as you might imagine. The first thing I want to do here is show you here on the left this list of the various types of resources, as they're called in Arches, or the concepts that make up a technical examination project for which we might be able to enter data. So you can see here, we can add information about collections, about digital resources, groups, instruments, modifications made to materials, observations, that is scientific experiments, people, places, things, projects, et cetera, et cetera. So there's many different concepts associated with a research project that we can enter data about. We're going to show in this example the uploading of data from a technical examination of a painting, which is, of course, a physical thing. So just to give you a sense of how deep these resource models are, I'm just going to click on physical thing here for a second and show you the types of data that you can enter. So you see here at left a list of the different data entry fields that you can explore. So for example, you can enter the name of an object. You could type the name of a painting in this case. You could indicate whether that's a preferred name, a catalog name, a formal title versus what's displayed. You can see that there's some metadata associated with something as simple as a name that lets you explain more of the context for it. You can indicate languages if that's important. Add what you need, click add, move on. You can see we can input things like types of object. Are we working on a ceramic, a drawing, a painting, etc. So again, metadata about a physical thing. And I won't click through all of these, but hopefully this gives you a sense of the different types of information that you can add and the level of detail or complexity. So you can include things like when it was produced, when it was destroyed, when parts were removed, when parts were added, persistent identifiers for the object. There's a complex amount of data that you can add. And resource editors like the one that I'm showing you here are a really good way of adding data for a singular thing, a singular physical thing in this case. But as anyone who works on the examination of works of art knows, our work intrinsically links several things, and you could expect an individual project to touch on several of the models that you see here at left. So how we deal with that in Arches is to use the concept of a workflow to ease our data entry. So let's take a look at workflows, which you find down here. I'm going to click on that, and what you'll see the system do is show me a list of workflows that we've already identified and built into the system that represent some of the steps of a technical analysis, the way it might be performed in the lab. So you can see there are things to walk you through creating a new research project, taking samples or identifying analysis areas on, for example, an object, uploading data, or reviewing data. So that sort of covers the first step of including data in the system. We'll walk through a couple of these just to give you a sense of how data entry works. So we'll start, much as we do in the lab, with identifying what project it is that we're undertaking. So I'm going to click on that new project workflow, and you'll see what should look relatively familiar from internet browsing, where you have a tabbed view with different titles about what you're going to be adding in terms of data, and then some very simple data entry forms. I should note here that we've gone to some effort to try and make these data entry forms as self-explanatory and simple as possible to help encourage all of us to actually use the system and upload and preserve our data. So you can see here, the first thing that the data entry form asks me for is for a project name. So hopefully we have one of those. I'm just going to say that we're going to work on a technical examination of a specific painting, that is irises. I'm going to say that's the primary title of this project, But you'll note that I could use anything here. If your organization had a specific naming structure for projects or a numbering system, anything like that, that could be the types of naming that you use. I'm going to having completed putting in a name, I'm going to go down here to the bottom left and save and continue. The next page asks me for things like a project statement, and it indicates here in this gray menu that that could include, for example, the objectives or the motivation for the project. Basically, this is providing you an opportunity to include some contextual information that may allow researchers to understand why a particular research was undertaken, in case that helps them understand the data itself. So here I'm going to note that the motivation for the project was pigment analysis and that we're looking for evidence of color change. Again, that may help researchers in future understand why I took the specific data that I did. You'll notice this is just a free text entry box, but everything I type here will eventually become searchable in the system. We also have the opportunity to add some metadata to this. So again, I could indicate specific types of statements that this might be. This is really just a description, so I'm going to delete something that was auto added there. But you'll note that we could include things like a classification, acknowledgements, that sort of thing, if it were important to your project. And again, we can specify language. As it is, I'm going to save and continue. And you'll see that the next tab asks me to indicate when the project starts. So basically, we're adding temporal information to the project. You can do this a number of ways. I can, for example, simply type a date. You see happening here, and you'll see that the date appears. You can also explore a calendar, much like you can in many applications, select a date that way. Or because the system is configured to deal with fuzzy dates, we can do something as generic as start to write a date like February 2021, and you'll see that the system auto-populates the earliest possible date in February of 2021, giving us a sort of boundary as to the date. And this helps us enter projects, including legacy projects, for which we may not have very specific information for this field. So having selected a date, we're going to save and continue. The next thing that it asks us to include are the project team. So it may be helpful to know who worked on a project. This might give you information, for example, like who to contact if you need additional information or access to something that's not uploaded into the system. So you can see, again, very, very simple. This asks us to include project team members, and there's just a drop-down box that says add a member. So I'm going to click in here. You can see that the system has auto-populated a list of names that are already in the system of people, but I want to add myself, so I'm going to start typing my name, and you can see that I already exist in the system. So I can just select myself, and I become appended to the project, as you see here. I did this work not by myself, but with my collaborator, Debbie Ormond. And you can see as I start to type her name that nothing comes up. So she's not already in the system, but you'll see that Arches very helpfully gives me the opportunity to just create a new person in line while I'm uploading the data. So I don't have to leave this workflow. I can just do it right here. So I'm going to create a new person. You'll see a new window opens with some of the data you can add about this person. So I'm just going to start typing her name. You can see, again, there's metadata associated with people. I can note that this is her common name or a nickname because it's not actually her full Irish name. I can put in language, and I can add her. I could include, if I wanted to, a statement about who this person is. So she is a conservator that was working on the project, for example. I could add that. I could add contact information, identifiers, you can see here on the left, the various types of metadata that I can add. Once I've added enough information that I think this will be a uniquely identifiable person, up here in the upper right, I can just return to the workflow I was working on, and you see that Debbie has been added to the project. Great, so I can save and continue if that was the whole project team. The next tab that gets highlighted here asks me to add objects to the project. So for the first release of Arches for Science, we've focused on the use case of a technical study of a work of art. So the assumption here is that for any given project, you need to add a work of art. So that's what this is asking me to add. Again, I have just a search box here. I can start to type irises, and we'll see that this particular painting that I want to talk about is listed with its accession number, which is the way the Getty Museum identifies objects. So I can identify the specific object by limiting that search. You see the object listed here. I click it, and you see here on the right that the painting has been added to the project. That's successfully done. If this was the only object in the project, I can again save and continue. The last tab here provides me a summary of what I've done. What is the information that I've added? And it tells me, for example, that I've created 2 resource instances. So this is basically models that have been created that didn't exist before, a project resource called Technical Examination of Irises, and a collection resource called the Collection for the Technical Examination of Irises. You'll note that I never typed this in. This was a collection name or identifier that was automatically appended so that I didn't have to think about it. It also shows me some of the information that I've added, which physical thing it listed to, and what other resources are related. So assuming that all looks correct, I can save the workflow. Now, you'll see that having saved it, the system pops me back to that list of workflows, so I can just simply move on to the next step if I'm ready to. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I want to pop back to that first search screen to just show you what's happened. So up here in the upper left, I'm going to start typing some of the letters of the name of the project I just created. And you'll see here that just with 2 letters, the Technical Examination of Irises pops up as a project. If I click that, you see that those 2 resources that it said had been created are now visible. So this is in real time creating these resources and adding them to the system. The next thing that we can do is look at some of what we've uploaded. So this Technical Examination of Irises, the actual project, I can look at what's related to that. So I can click on this little tab down here at the bottom right of that particular entry that says Related Resources. And you see that the technical examination has links to 2 orange nodes labeled with people's names, and this green node that is associated with the collection. Over here on the right, if I switch to showing you the legend, you can see that that blue node indicates the project, the green one, the collection or set of paintings or objects that are part of that project, and the orange represents people. So all of the types of resources that we think we've added and the connections between them appear to now be present in the system. What's kind of cool is there may be links here that we don't already see. So for example, if I use this little plus sign up here and then click on collection, you'll see that irises appeared, which makes sense because I added that object to the collection. But if I expand on irises, you'll see that a new orange node representing a person appears. That is Vincent van Gogh, who was the painter of this object. Nowhere in the data entry that I just did I add Vincent, but he is connected to the painting because the system came preloaded with a lot of the information from our museum system that includes all the tombstone information about our objects. So as a scientist, without having to indicate any of the metadata around Vincent van Gogh that we know, that's all already automatically associated with the project. We'll come back to this resource list, this graphical representation of the data a couple times as we chat today, but for now, we'll pop back to the workflows. As a scientist working in the lab, once I've identified my project and incorporated it into the system, as you just saw, the next thing I might want to do is indicate where I did some scientific analysis. And in this case, we're going to use the analysis areas workflow to start to represent that. So I'm going to click on that, and you'll see a very similar data entry workflow system. So as you can see, we've made these all look about the same so that you have a real intuitive understanding of what you're doing. You'll note here in the gray, it tells us what are we trying to do in this workflow. We are trying to record locations and regions of interest on this painting. And you can see there's some additional information that may be helpful. You can dismiss that if you don't need it, but there is information to be had if you want it. The first thing that we're going to do on this page is indicate what project we're working on. So again, I'm going to start typing irises, and that technical examination that I added comes up as an option, so I can select it. You'll see that having selected that project, a new dropdown pops up, which basically says, I know that there are some objects or some paintings associated with this project. Which one of them are you working on? So if I click there, you'll see in the dropdown, the one object that was part of that project appears, it's irises. So I select that, save and continue. The next thing that the system asks me for is an image service. It says, please select an image service for the object that you can use to draw the locations, basically to create a spot map of where we did anything. There's nothing I can select though, but there is this nice green button that says create a new one. So I probably need to do that. I'll click that, and just like the people, it pops me to a different workflow that says, please select images and drag and drop them onto this part of the page. So I'm going to go to my desktop, grab a couple images, and drop them onto this page. And you see immediately that they load with the names that they were given, an overall view of the painting I'm working on, and a particularly important detail. And I'm given the option here on the right to add some metadata about this image service. So just a quick aside, I'm using that term of art, image service. What does this mean? This means that Arches for Science is actually working with IIIF image service information. And that information then needs its own metadata. So here I'm going to say that this is irises images for analysis. Again, any name I wanted, I can include. So if an organization has naming standards for this, you can use them. I could indicate that these were images provided by imaging services if I wanted to. You can leave this description information blank. You can see here, you can include attribution data, who took the image, you can add logos, lots of information that you can apply to this system. Once I've added as much as I want, I click save, and then up here at the top, return to the workflow. And what you see is, having created an image service, I now have an option to select. So this also goes to show you that if you had existing IIIF image servers that had particular sets of images that your organization uses for an object, all of those could be associated with the object and available to select here just via a radio button. If you select the one you want, you can simply save and continue. The next page actually loads the image service that I've just selected. So you see those same two images down here at the bottom. I can toggle between them if I want to. You could search in those images if you wanted to, or you can do what we came here to do, which is to add regions of interest. I'll note, because this is a IIIF image service, I can do things like zoom on the image, drag it around, move it, interact with the image to get the best image location that I can. To actually add a region, you're going to use this purple button that says Add New Analysis Area. I'll simply click that, and you see some new options appear. It asks me what type of area I would like to add. I'm simply going to add a point. So I'll select that. And you see that as I hover over the image, I now get a little blue circle, and it says Click Map to place the marker. So I'm going to say I did some analysis down here in this blue iris. So I'm going to mark that. And then it asks me for a name. So I'm just going to call this Area 1. Just like every scientist everywhere, I'm going to give it this very generic name, Area 1. And what you see happening in the gray here is that Arches knows that that's not going to be a sufficient title for this object, that after a couple of years, there's going to be 17,000 Area 1s in the system. So it is actually naming it a much more specific name. It is creating something called Area 1, region of irises with this accession number. So it's creating a more unique identifier for that. You can see here I can note who's doing this annotation. So this works just like adding a person. I can find myself and note that I created this annotation. Having added the information, I'll click Save. And you can see here that the system is building many parts, many resources, adding information to many data models. And now up here at the top, I have that area as an option. If I'd like to add a second, rinse and repeat, we can add a second point, say here in the leaves, call this Area 2, And I'm not going to bother with an annotator, and just click save. Again, you see resources being created, and now we have 2 regions. Having done as many as we want, we can save and complete the workflow, and we're brought back to our area of the workflows. If I pop over to our resource graph that we looked at a little bit earlier, we now see that nothing has changed because we haven't asked the system to show us any additional information. But if I now expand again on the collection, here, this dark green node, you'll notice that 2 additional physical things have appeared, and those are the 2 regions that we just created. So again, this is being updated in real time. We're going to pop back to our workflow just to indicate that if you wanted to take a sample, that would work almost exactly the same way. So if we wanted to indicate that a sample had been taken from this object, we again tabbed view, asks us for what project are we looking at. We're looking at that technical examination of irises. And in this case, now you see that because of that live updating, those new physical areas that I've created appear as options. So if I want to link the sample to a specific one of these areas, I can. So I'm going to actually note that this sample came from area 1. Okay, I'm going to save and continue. You can see now here information about the sampling activity, if that's important. So just like we've done on other screens, I can indicate the person that did this work. So I can put myself here. I can note the date that I did this analysis, pick any date, same way as we did for the project itself. And if we want, we can indicate why this sample was taken. So just like for the overall project, this allows us to record that contextual information that may help someone understand why a sample appears the way it does. And it's because it was taken for a specific purpose that we can record. If it's important for your organization, you can also record the sampling technique. So if you want to note that this was using, a particular scalpel or a particular material, in case you see that material show up in your analyses, you can record that. Down here at the bottom, I just want to kind of note another sort of hidden feature of the system, which is that you'll notice I could show the experiment name, just to show you that by adding this information that I am, even though I'm doing it just sort of in normal English, it's creating a resource that is the sampling activity that happened in area 1, that itself is a region of irises that happened on a particular date. So it's creating an incredibly unique identifier for this process. Don't have to care about that as the person inputting data, but the system is doing that work for me. Having input as much data as I want, again, I'll save and continue. And you can see here that the system provides me the opportunity to add additional images. So same as for the object, we can add particular images if we'd like to for this object or the sampling activity. So I'm going to grab a couple of images that I have, drop them here, and what I've added are before and after images of the sampling and a picture of a cross-section. Just as before, I can add some particular information about this. And once I have all the information that I want, I'll return to the workflow. Selecting that particular image stack, I then save and continue. We now come to a system that asks, or a part of the system that asks us to, again, identify where exactly this particular sample was taken. I can add information, same as we did to identify an analysis area. And just to give you a sense of how flexible this is, I'll use a different tool this time. I'll use a polygon. This now allows me to just draw a shape on the map so that I can indicate a more precise area that was sampled for this particular sample acquisition. So you see it noted here, same as before, it wants a name, so I'll give it one. You could provide a description, so if you record things like the specific X and Y position from a corner of a painting that you wanted to include, you could describe your visual analysis, the physicality of how it felt to take this sample, that it was friable, for example. Any of that information could go here. And again, you could add a motivation if you wanted. Just like for the identification areas, you can see the system creating many of the resources that it needs, pre-filling models, telling you what it needs, and we can move on to our next step. And what you see at the end, and I forgot to show you this for the analysis areas, but the same thing exists for that, at the summary step, you see, much as we did for the project, something that indicates what was created, all of the information that you added, whether you provided a sampling technique, for example, and it shows me the IIIF image that shows the annotations. The other thing created on this summary page is any of the information that I added. So it shows me that this is sample 1. When I click on that, it highlights the area. So if you had more than one, you can see that you would be able to see them highlighted in green on the image and any of the information that we've included. Making sure that that's all correct and feeling happy with it, I'll save and complete the workflow. So now we've told the system what we have and where the sampling was done. So we can, again, go back to that resources or the graphical representation of these resources. We can make sure that it happened. We know that we added a sample to area 1. So I'm going to expand on that. And hopefully you can see now that there's now been a sampling activity added to this graphical node. So that information has been created. Having successfully identified all the areas where work was done, of course, the next thing we need to do is actually upload some spectral data. So we're going to use this upload dataset workflow to do that. And again, we're going to get a workflow of tabbed views that tell us what data needs to be entered. This one starts with something that I think a lot of folks don't think about initially, which is where does this data come from? That is, what type of sample area do you need to relate the data to? In much of the work that happens on objects, we have 2 very different types of analyses. One is spot analysis that comes from a specific and identifiable location, basically one that requires me to have identified those regions of interest that I just did. And you'll see, pardon me, that there's a radio button for that. Other data may require the consumption of an object. So it's going to use the whole of something rather than an identified location on that thing. So that would be, for example, the mass spec data that you take or the GC mass spec data that you take from a sample. You're going to want to note that that consumed or came from the entirety of the sample, and you would select the second one. So let's say we're doing some spot data. We'll select data from a discrete area, save and continue. Much like our region of interest work, the system is going to ask me to associate this with a project. So again, I'll start to type irises to find that technical examination. And here it's going to ask me, what is this coming from? I just did some XRF sampling on the painting overall, so I'm going to select the whole painting, although you'll notice here that those areas and my samples are now in this drop-down menu. But we did non-invasive XRF of the painting, so we're just going to select the painting. We'll save and continue to take us to a new tab, and this asks us for information about the instrument that was used. So this allows us to start to include some of the metadata around the actual scientific equipment used to capture information. In any institution's implementation of this, there may be a set preloaded list of instrumentation. And so I'm just going to select the instrument that this was. This was X-ray fluorescence, so I'm just going to select the instrument. That's going to sort of tell the system many things about the data that we're wanting to use. So this is work that's been done in advance to tell the system what is an XRF spectrum, what are the important parameters, what do we need to know. So we've selected that. You can see here there's an option drop-down menu to link to a procedure. That's looking for a textual document. So if you have a procedure for a particular instrument that you use time and time and time again, if you can upload that as a textual document, you can just link it to this rather than having to type anything. If the parameters that you use or the procedure that you use is more variable, you also have this open text box where it can be added. So I can add parameters that were important to the experiment that apply to every spectrum that I'm going to upload. So for example, in this particular case, I used a rhodium tube instrument with some particular settings. So I'm going to apply that to the whole of the data set. As before, if I click this, you can see that the system is providing a very specific identifier for this information. When we click Save and Continue, the next thing the system asks for is, again, some data. Go ahead and upload some data if you'd be so kind. So again, I've got some prepped for you here, so I'll just grab a couple of spectra, and you see that when I dropped them onto the screen, the system immediately changed and showed me the regions that I had already identified on this painting. So what we see now here on the right is areas that have been identified. So you see here area 1 and area 2 were these two areas that I identified. As I click on them, you can see the color change. So the green one is the active one. It helps me remember what these two areas were. And you can see here the names of two individual XRF spectra that I've just dropped onto the system. So the reason this is toggled over to showing me the regions that I've identified is it's asking me to actually associate these particular spectra with a specific spot on the analysis, or on the painting, pardon me. So this is really linking the analysis area to the spectral information. So how we do this, we're just going to select the area. I'm going to click on these files and say add those to the data set because they both come from the same basic area. And I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to say that this is area 01 XRF. Again, the system is creating a more specific name for that underneath for me. I could, if I wanted to, add additional data to number 2 if I had more. If I'd forgotten to upload them all in that first set, you can see that I could drag or click here to upload additional files, so you can kind of come back and add to this. I'm going to go ahead and save what I've done. And then down here at the bottom left, move on to the next step. And what you see is because I selected an instrument in one of the first steps of this workflow, the system knows that this is an XRF spectrum and actually shows me that area 1 has 2 XRF spectra associated with it. It actually plots them for me and allows me to see them. You can see as I float over it that it's dynamic in the sense that I could read that this peak is at 8.636, so I could identify what that means if I were coming to the system and trying to understand what this is. And the other thing that you see here is if I select an individual file in this area 1 that I've created, that there's the opportunity to add additional metadata. So in this case, we can add specific file parameters. So for example, that this was a 5-second acquisition with no averaging. Could be added here, but that's something that may be true only of this file, but not of the next one. So we can add that kind of specific information. And the text box below that, you see, says file interpretation. So if we wanted to, we could add what this actually means, which again, I'm just doing in natural language. If I click Save here, and then select the other XRF spectrum that I've uploaded, you'll note that these two areas are empty. So hopefully that shows you that this information is associated with a specific text file that is the spectral information. So you can see here if the second file was, for example, a 10-second acquisition, I could note that here and that would be saved with the spectrum. Once we've done all of this, linking of the data to a location, we can move on to the next step. And much like the other workflows, we get a summary that shows us what we've done. Again, resources connected, data that you've entered, the IIIF manifest showing that analysis area, including a table that shows me what information has been uploaded or added about this information. So you can see, for example, that I bothered to interpret one spectrum, but not the other. Again, if I'm happy with all of this, I can save and complete the workflow. So the next step here, again, if we go back to this resource graph and look at what's been done, we can look at, again, the area. Gotta find it. There it is. We have samples. We have the collections. We have, if I expand on the area, this XRF. So we can see all of this data about the XRF being added to the instrumentation.